Tell us who we got here today.
This is my very dear friend, Elsie McKee. She is the founder of a nonprofit, Woman Cradle of Abundance, that serves women in the Congo, that has the same name. It's just in French, Femme Berceau de l'Abondance. She has just written a book about the amazing journey of Mama Monique, who heads the Women's Center and has a giant ministry that serves 1,200 women who are in hard times, who don't have anywhere to turn. She's accompanied today by her husband, John, and her sister, Beth, and her brother-in-law, Ray. We're so glad that they've made this long journey down here. This is our 5th event since they arrived in Virginia. It's been an excellent trip, and we're excited to keep spreading the word about Women Cradle of Abundance.
Thank you so much, Anna. Anna is a wonderful, wonderful friend and member of our board of, well, we would be the directing board, but we're also the operative board because we do all the work ourselves. I'm not sure whether we're a board of trustees or a board of directors or a staff, because we wear all the hats. And this weekend, Anna has been wearing the major staff hat, orchestrating an opportunity for us to tell friends here about this amazing group of people in the Democratic Republic of Congo, right in the middle of Africa. Mama Monique Misenga Mukuna, maybe I should stop for just a moment and say, in Africa, you never address an adult without some kind of title. And you don't speak of another adult without some kind of title, unless. So it can be something as simple as mother or father or aunt or uncle. And in fact, with extended family system, mother and father, mama, mamu, and tatu, pretty much apply to all of the grown-ups in your region, your area, and can be applied to just about any adult. So the center of Africa, Democratic Republic of Congo, is where Beth and I were born and grew up. Our grandparents went to Congo in 1911. And my father and his siblings were born and grew up in Congo. And so we've had the privilege of living in this amazing community church, these people for whom God and the things spiritual are woven into every aspect of their lives. It doesn't mean that they are super saints. At least some of them are, like Mama Monique. But it means that the spiritual has a relevance for everything in life. And so does family. When you ask who someone is, they will probably tell you about their ancestry or their community or their children, their brothers and sisters. And so I decided this morning, I've been telling this story in a variety of ways over the last few days, but I thought this morning I would start by talking about Mama Monique and her family, because that's a good way to get into it. And Beth, if you would like to chime in on any of this if you want. And John too, certainly. The small group of American Presbyterians who went to Congo in 1891 were just a tiny handful of people. You probably know how Christianity spreads. It's not the people who are the missionaries who do things. They spread a seed. They plant a seed with some people who think that's a new way of hearing about God. That's a new way of thinking about how I can be related to the spiritual powers. And many traditional religious communities believe in evil spirits or various forms of power that our ancestors have, for better or worse. And that can really control people's lives. In some ways, it's enormously comforting that they have these spiritual ancestors all around them, but it can also be really difficult because sorcery and the various ways that people can harm each other by ill wishing are just as real as the powers for love and goodness that their ancestors and families have shared. And so for some of these people, it was really amazing to discover a teaching that said they didn't have to be afraid of evil spirits anymore. That there was someone, Jesus, who could protect them from that. You didn't have to tell African people that there is a God. You might have to define who that God was, because the character of God in traditional religion is basically a little bit like someone way up in the sky who created things, but you really don't want to call attention to yourself, because that might or might not be for your benefit. But to be taught that God is the Father of Jesus Christ and loves us and cares about us had a real appeal for many of these people. And so when in a very short time, some of these African people who heard the little handful of missionaries began to decide, that's something I want. And they began to gather around the place where these first two men, an African American and a white Caucasian American, had come. Over the first 20 years of the Presbyterians in Congo, half of them were African American and half were Caucasian. They didn't specifically try to divide it up that way, it just happened that way. And so the communities in this, they started a place called Luebo. As far as I can tell from Mama Monique's story, her great-grandmother's family were among the very first converts. Her great-grandmother was born at Luebo, Mission, which is the little group of Christians that grew up around that early planted missionary station. And her family has been leaders in the church since then. This was her father's grandmother, and her father was his main influence in her whole life. Her mother is absolutely wonderful, but women don't have very much power in Africa. So how her life evolved depended in great measure on how her father regarded women. And he was reared to believe that women were as important as men, which is very countercultural in a strongly patriarchal context. There are some matriarchal communities, but very, very few. So by and large, people in Congo live in a patriarchal context where girls are secondary. Mama Monique herself is the oldest girl in a family of 14. That is, she has 10 sisters. She has one older brother and two much, 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 much younger little brothers. But since a woman's main task is to produce male children, her mother was considered totally inadequate. Neighbors and relatives thought her mother wasn't worth anything. She had a boy, fine, but then she had 10 girls. This was totally excessive uselessness. So Mama Monique is the oldest of these girls, but her father said that his girls would have the same advantages and education as his sons. So Mama Monique went to school. She went to primary school. That was pretty traditional in her generation. Primary school in one of the Bantu languages, Shaluba, which happens to be the one which we spoke when we were growing up. But then she went to secondary school, and that's very unusual for girls in her generation because secondary school was in French. So you had to learn French to pass the entrance exams, and the secondary schools are very few and far between. You have to pay for schooling anyway. Your parents have to be able to pay the fees for education. But secondary school, you had to be a boarding student unless you lived just close enough that you could walk to school. So it was a pretty big investment to send your daughters as well as your sons to school. And he was determined. So she went to it was the only Presbyterian secondary school when she was a child. Happens to be in the place where our father was born, Ibanga, and got a good education. Then her father sent her to university. Now, this is something that never happened in her generation. His brothers, or one of his brothers, said, "Your girls are frogs. They're not worth anything. Why are you educating them?" And he went right on doing it. So she went ahead with this educational program, but he also taught his children the kinds of things he did. Now, he was a vet, so he didn't teach them veterinarian skills, but he taught them the farming and animal husbandry skills, which he used to ensure that his family and all the neighbors had something to eat. Whenever anybody was in need, they went to their door and they got a meal. I say this, I know it's true because Mama Monique does that. She copies that, and she learned how to farm. She learned how to manage small animals, chickens and ducks and rabbits particularly. I don't think she has had any goats, but her father did. And he had a fish pond, but she doesn't really have a space for a fish pond. But this education, this Christian grounding, her father thought that Genesis 1:27 was to be enacted. God created them male and female in God's image. And that's one of her favorite verses. She teases sometimes. It's funny to watch her tell it because she's a little twinkle in her eye, but her face is pretty serious. And she says, God, the other creation story, God created Adam first and then Eve. And she says, well, God was practicing on Adam, and Eve was the masterpiece. You can see the kind of sense of humor. And she says this basically with just a twinkle in her eye and a little bit of a smile. So she's not pushing it over. Her other favorite verse is John 10:10, and Jesus came to give life and to give life abundantly. So Mama Monique grew up, went to university, was a secondary school teacher and principal, which of course is again something that women didn't do. And then she discovered she was married, and she and her husband Tatu Bukuna had 9 children. She said to me later that if she had known about birth control, about family planning, she would have had fewer children, because family planning is something that they try to teach now. But she has 5 girls and 4 boys, and educated all the way through. So her children are amazing citizens, very gifted and well educated. All except one son who was stubborn. After high school, he decided he wanted to go to university in Europe. And she said, I can't pay for that. You go to university in Kinshasa or we aren't going to do it. This is one of her, this is the, I don't know what you'd call it, the problem child of the family. Not a problem, but the sort of the independent, we will do it my way. But all of the children are educated. But what she was discovering as a teacher is that she really couldn't afford to send all of her children to school on a teacher's salary. So she went back to doing some of the kinds of things that her father had taught her, like sewing, like business, like raising crops that she could sell as well as feed her family with, doing a very entrepreneurial kind of skill. And she was very successful. She went even as far as South Africa or Morocco in her export-import business, because Congo is a very wealthy country, minerals. Its property is owned, or at least controlled, by the top 1%. And most people are extremely poor. Quite a lot of people basically live from hand to mouth. They are subsistence farmers out in the countryside without any access to medical care or much in the way of regular education. In the cities, of course, they can't farm for themselves, so they have to do small businesses in order to feed themselves. So the character of the work that she was doing meant that she was effectively selling her products to the highest levels of the society, but she was very much aware of the ones that didn't have. So she's walking home and she sees a child who looks very unwell, malnourished, and she asks him, where do you live? And he goes and shows her, and she sees that this little house the floor is wet. They live too close to a little stream for the floor ever to be dry. The parents don't have any way to make a living. They had sent their child out to beg to get a little food. So she feeds him, and she takes food to the family, and she discovers, oh, in this neighborhood, there are lots more of them. So she gets her church involved. She says, looky, let's organize a group at our church, and we will make regular meals, once a day for the malnourished children. Now, they had to be very careful about this. They said, we will only take malnourished children. If you've got a home where you get fed once a day, you need to stay at home. If you live in a family where there's just nothing to eat every day, or where your family divides it up, one day this child eats and tomorrow the next child eats, then we will provide food. The thing is, they knew that they couldn't stretch it to everybody, so they had to choose the ones who were most at risk. But they got a nutrition program going. And then she saw that there were children on the street. These children might be being fed, but they didn't have anywhere to go to school. They couldn't pay the fees. So the next thing we do is work on finding ways to pay fees for them, because you have to have uniforms and school supplies and school fees. School's not free. So she's been doing this while she is working, but she gets involved in the church and begins doing it as a full-time job for the church, which means that she no longer can do her business, so she is having a hard time making ends meet. But she continues to do it. She is one of the very, very few people I know in Congo who works to serve other people without being paid for, without a salary. That's practically impossible. I'm not criticizing the others. If you can't feed your family, if you can't eat, there's no way you're going to be able to devote your life just to doing benevolence work, because you won't eat. She has managed to support herself more or less. It's much less affluent than when she was doing her business full time, but she's managed to support herself while she continues to do these other ministries. So one of the things she was doing, do you remember the World Council of Churches Decade of Churches in Solidarity with Women, a 10-year span, when the World Council and other bodies tried to focus on particular needs. They had a decade in effort to concentrate church attention on violence and ways that the church could intervene in violence. Well, this was a decade when they would concentrate on the status of women in the church, in the society, in the ways, because they recognized the churches were not giving women access to higher offices. They were basically using them as the best source of looking after the building, feeding the children, taking care of things. So 1988 to 98, internationally, there was this effort to encourage churches to think about not only women in the churches, but in general, how can we educate ourselves better about the status and the actual reality of women, both in our own communities and beyond it. And at the end of the decade, they had a big festival in Harare, and countries all around the world sent women to say, what have you been doing with your 10 years? And Monique was one of the delegates from Congo, and there was a number of other women. And they got there and they listened to what women around the world had been doing. And they said, that's fascinating. We're doing some of that, but we're doing it sort of spread out, scattered around without an organization. And to be perfectly honest, when you're doing it through the church, the men usually have the final veto. At least that's what they had been experiencing. So she said we ought to have a nonprofit or organization that's women run so that the women have the final say, at least in that one context. So she and the other delegates from Congo, when they got back to Kinshasa, they said, okay, we're going to start a women's organization. Well, it started out just as a movement. Basically, we would say a consciousness raising movement to help other women begin to think about this. And women started coming, and then they came, more came, and more came. And the church leaders got very excited and very upset. You are causing a revolution. You are going to have a rebellion of women. This is dreadful. What are you doing? So they had to go and sort of gently talk to the leaders of the church and say, no, we're not trying to cause a rebellion against the church. We are trying to encourage women. And this is actually not denominational. It's anybody can come. It's ecumenical. Now, all of these happen to be Christian women, but they have welcomed people who are not Christian. Actually, most Congo, about give or take 80%, maybe 75, 80%, call themselves Christian, whatever their denominational context. So there's no sense that, oh, secular women will feel excluded. It's anybody is welcome to come. And so most of them actually are Christian of one kind or another, but they organized it as an ecumenical women's group. And I say they start with the idea of consciousness raising, and they organized it as a nonprofit so that they actually could have some identity. And they called it Femme Berceau de l'Abondance, Woman Cradle of Abundance, because Jesus came to give life and give it abundantly. Now, when you stop and remember that women are actually on the margins of their society, the idea that they are going to be the cradle of abundance for other people or even their own families, if it weren't faith, if it weren't a statement of faith, it would be hubris. It would be a kind of a statement of pride and look at us. No, but it's faith. So they set out this organization, and then they began to realize as the women come to them, they need more concrete assistance, things like practical examples of how to improve their lives, educational possibilities, empowerment. They also need a place to come for refuge. There's no such thing as women's shelters. There's no such thing as Social Security. The two of their main concerns are violence against women and female poverty. And so that's where they have focused their attention. And it's really been a kind of growing operation depending on the people who came to them who had needs, the kinds of things that they proposed as issues, and the kinds of possibilities that Monique and her circle of friends had for responding. Sometimes it was as simple as this woman's farm is working well, but this one's isn't. Can you tell the others what you're doing that's working? Or this woman's small animal husbandry. Her chickens are really producing. Maybe set a time for her to talk to the others who would like to get into that business. It also has to do with things like consciousness raising in other ways. It's a tradition that you have to do whatever your father or your husband says. You don't have a choice or a voice of your own. What would be the possibility of imagining that you as a girl could express an opinion and have it heard? That you as a wife could say no to your husband? This is very untraditional. And remember, I want to say that there are lots of good things about African traditional society. It is a extremely well-developed community. They don't have Social Security or things like that because the family looks after the family. There's a real problem, though, if you happen to be an elderly widow with no family left. You don't have any refuge. But along with this tightly knit family tradition is a very strong patriarchal orientation. And women have shared this. I mean, a lot of these women, one of the things that Monique has said, we don't just start by telling our husbands what they're doing wrong. We start by looking at how we are maintaining some of these injustices. Boys are valued, girls are not. So boys get to have playtime when they're growing up. Little girls start working from the time that they're 3 or 4, able to take care of a younger sibling or go haul water. Mothers participate in this. Why not? Because that's how they were reared. That's the value system that they have imbibed. They know their value depends on having males, having sons, and seeing that those sons are educated and produce good results for the family. The girls, they're going to marry them off at 13 or 14 and get a dowry for them. And you'll probably use that dowry, the money that comes for this daughter, to pay the dowry for the son so that he can get married. You're just swapping it around. We are all girls, and people commiserated with father for having all girls. And they used to tease that the dowries given for us would then be handed over to his brother to be the dowries for my uncle's sons, so that we would have the family rotation in there. Father didn't have sons, Uncle Mac did. But the thing about this is helping the women also to realize I can make a change by giving my sons chores, by treating them as I treat my daughters, just around the house so that they have to do some things. And when it comes time to go to school, insist that the girls' fees get paid as well as the boys. If we can send any children to school, the girls as well as the boys. And then also the expanding it beyond that. But anyway, so Woman Cradle of Abundance, Femme Berceau de l'Abondance, is their organization. And we got acquainted when we were adults. Mama Monique and I actually were born, and Beth actually, were all born in the same province. But Beth and I were born at Luebo, which is where her father was born. But she was born in the other part of the really large province. And so we didn't meet as children, but we met as adults. And when I did, I thought, yay! She is the most amazing person. Beth and John and I went to visit her in 2010. This was several years after I had met her. And cut the story short, she was being considered an uppity woman in her church because she was so successful. And so the male authorities had decided that they were going to fire her from her position, where she had been doing all of these various kinds of activities. So what did she do? She started them all again in her home. So when we went to visit, we saw this sewing school that she was starting at her home, and we went to visit the women's center, which she had built and which was falling apart after she had been thrown out. And so we said, we have to do something to enable her to keep her ministry going. The ministry through the Presbyterian Church USA, that had been working well until she was excluded by the leaders of her Presbyterian denomination. This is only the top. Everybody else in the church was horrified. The women followed her. They said, do we really want to still be a part of this church if they're going to throw out our leader? And she said, remain in the church. We are still part of the church just because this handful of leaders has done what we all recognize is not just, does not mean we give up on the church, does not mean we give up on Jesus. We continue to worship. But what happened was then that the Presbyterian Church of the USA felt that they could not intervene in any way in the independent Presbyterian Church in Kinshasa, which was entirely appropriate. So, but they said, if you want to work with Mama Monique, that's absolutely fine with us. We agree that we disagree with what the church in Congo, what their leaders in Congo did, but they are an independent church. We don't want an imperialist approach that says, we will tell you what to do. They tried mediation. So did the international church. They sent a group of leaders from all around the world, the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, World Communion of Reformed Churches. And the leaders weren't going to listen to their fellow African Christian Reformed Presbyterian leaders. Anyway, it's a big mess. Since then, those leaders have died, and the new leaders keep begging Mama Monique to come back and do whatever she can. But she says, I already have another way of carrying on this ministry. So that's how we got involved. We started a little nonprofit here. We named it Woman Cradle of Abundance, FIBA Inc. Now, if you're thinking of starting a nonprofit, don't use the same name as the one in the other country, because no one will ever keep it straight. And you will have all kinds of explaining to do, explanatory difficulties, but never mind. So we started a little nonprofit to help her continue her ministry. And that's where Cradle of Abundance came from, Woman Cradle of Abundance. And this is her story. Because over the years, I taped it. Every time we would meet, I would ask for more questions. My favorite interjection was, when? Because I wanted to try to figure out, now, where does this story fit in the larger picture? And then I transcribed it and translated it. And then I had to cut it down. It used to be about twice this size, but no publisher was going to touch it. So there are all kinds of stories that I had to cut out. But anyway, that's what I've brought to visit today, Mama Monique and her stories. And I would be very happy to answer any questions or entertain conversation about this.
How did you and Anna get tied up together with this?
Very good question. Anna is a marvelous musician, as you know, and my home church in Princeton is Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church. One summer day, she was substitute organist. And you can see the pretty things that the sewing school makes, and Beth's wearing some of them. Actually, I've got some here, but I didn't scatter them all out. I had my arms full because someone at church had said, I'd like to see them, buy them. I do any kind of a kind of, you might say, a pop-up bazaar. And this fellow church member had missed it. And she said, oh, can you bring some of the things that you had when we had the Harvest Bazaar? I mean, I'm not by myself, but when the women do the Harvest Bazaar, I get a table and put things out. So I said, okay, sure. She didn't have to be there that day, but Anna was there. And I was carrying all this stuff in, and Anna said, oh, how pretty. And I said, yes, do you want to hear about it? Which, of course, is what I do immediately, anytime, everywhere. It's one reason why I wear these things. I mean, I think they're beautiful, but they also get attention. And so I said, yes, please come. We would like to have you come and learn more about it. So anyhow, you have been very patient with my babbling on and on and on. But I would just love for you to read her story. There's some hair-raising incidents in it where she is facing people with guns pointed at her, and she talks through it. It's rather amazing she's still alive. So she, as well as any other things that you would like to know about it. And Anna can certainly tell you more. We have a website. Those of us who are, shall we say, dinosaurs in technology, don't know how to keep websites very well up to date. So if you see things that are perhaps not the latest information, it's informative. It's not, this is the day's news. This is the month's news. I try to get a newsletter up about once a month. So, but
These books, can you and Anna leave some of these? So
certainly,
sell them? Okay, great.
Yeah.
that would be absolutely great.
Hey, Willis, can you say one for me, and I'll send a check, a donation. Should I send it to Willis, Elsie, or to you, or to Anna? Or?
Well, it doesn't matter. Oh, you could send it, let's see. Any of those are fine.
Okay, I'll send it to Willis. Yeah, so.
Okay, and you can address it to woman, or make it payable to Woman Cradle of Abundance.
Women's Cradle of Abundance. Okay, we'll do that.
Got it. Yes.
That's the name of the nonprofit.
Does women have,
It's a singular.
yeah,
Because it's the
Women.
generic woman
woman?
Cradle of Abundance, just like a human race, man does this, thus and so. Well, it's woman. Although it gets said Women Cradle of Abundance as often as the other way. So I stopped worrying about correcting it. But technically, it's the generic, the whole of womankind.
I'm glad
Elsie,
you want the
Elsie.
book.
Yes.
I'm doing a 12-week course called Sacred Ground, and it's a 12-week course on racism. Yeah. So we're meeting again Tuesday. So I'll bring this up and see if, I can stir in, because it's on racism and everybody is just feeling lost. Like, what can I do? What can I do? And certainly this would be one example. So I'll bring it up Tuesday night and see if it can stir up some interest.
That would be absolutely wonderful. A Linton small group at my church and our neighboring church. Mine is the African American Presbyterian Church. The neighboring church is the Caucasian one, and we've been doing things together. We're reading it as our Linton small group, and it's working really well. That would be great.
Okay.
And she tells a good story. It's Beth, did you want to say something?
Yeah, no, I've had the privilege of getting to know Mama Monique and listening in on Elsie's interviews with many of the participants in her ministry, the young girls and women that she's basically rescued from the streets. But the book captures that very well, so that those of you who haven't had the chance to do that can really get a sense of how God is working through Mama Monique.
And as Beth says, Beth and John and I were together several times visiting her. It's not just her story.
Yeah.
We interviewed colleagues and students and graduates of the sewing school, and she draws women in. She's the visionary leader, but she never does it by herself. It wouldn't happen without her, but she really engages lots of people.
I was going to ask, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just curious about because how many generations, has there been now multiple generations that have sort of gone through her ministry and school where you see the real fruit to keep in the sort of biblical language of her ministry and things sprouting up all around the Congo? I mean, the people, and then my other part of that is, do we find that many of the women stay in the Congo and sort of begin to affect these changes as opposed to sort of moving to America or Europe or something?
Yes to both. Although it's a little more complicated than that, because in the nature of her ministry, she and her colleagues take the poorest of the poor, which means that most of the young women are illiterate or semi-literate. They've never been able to go to school. Some of them are coming from forced prostitution to survive. So when they graduate, they are now capable of supporting themselves and their families. They really are not able to function in another society, probably, because simply getting to the point of being productive citizens in their own society. Now, there are occasional exceptions. A few of the women who come, one of the things they did was start a sewing school, because Congo doesn't have factories for ready-made clothes, which means that a tailor can make a good living. Now, you have to be really talented, because people will bring you a picture. That's the dress I want. Here's the piece of material. When can you have it ready? No patterns, no nothing. So they have to know everything about making this. The women who graduate from the sewing school are very competent, but they are not highly educated. Since many of them come illiterate or semi-literate, the program includes literacy lessons, reproductive health, general education, things that they will need, women's rights, human rights, to give them the capacity to start at the more or less middle level of their society. They'll still be closer to the bottom than we would like. But Beth, you were saying?
I was just going to say, in terms of generations, their children are going to be able to eat and go to primary school, where maybe that would have been totally out of the question before. So and be healthier. So in that sense, the next generation is in a lot better place than they would have been without this.
Exactly. And we are seeing the
Yeah.
children of these graduates going to school and having their own professions.
Right, a whole new world, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
And the girls as well as the boys, so that
Oh, yes.
that change in culture and consciousness is carrying on.
And family planning.
Mhm.
I mean, that may sound like a minor thing to us, but
We take it for granted.
yeah, John?
Mhm.
I'm going to try to make this fast. This is related. The uppity women
Mhm.
in the church were kicked out, not just because they were uppity. I mean, that was sort of annoying to them. The fact is that they also, when they accrued, like if they ran a fundraiser, what they wouldn't do was to give the men a cut of that. So that they wanted the rake. They wanted 15% of whatever the women generated. And what the women and what Women Cradle of Abundance does is it teaches women that it's good for women to control the money. And that's what the cradle is about. Cradle is good for rearing children, but what Cradle of Abundance is teaching is how to create an environment around the child, around choice, that women can, it's good to own money. You don't have to share money with men for no